Okay. Let's see if I can share screen. Okay. All right. I think we got this. So, hello, my name is Heather Forbes. Thanks for so much for tuning into my presentation. I'm going to talk to you today about a collaborative model to improve augmentative and alternative communication for students with autism. So just to tell you a little bit more about me, I've been a speech language pathologist for 14 years, and I last worked as an SLP in preschool classrooms for students with autism. I've been a board certified behavior analyst for 7 years, and I actually worked for Patton, consulting in various public school classrooms for students with autism. And now I'm about to start my third year as a doctoral student in special education at the University of Kansas. And my research interests are in communication interventions for students with autism. So I wear a lot of hats, but as you can see, all my hats are very related. And it's why I'm passionate about collaboration for students with autism. All right. And I'm assuming if you're watching this presentation, that means that you're somewhat interested in collaboration too, because ultimately we have a shared motivation. We're all here to improve outcomes for students with autism. So here is my agenda for today. I'm going to do a brief overview of autism and AAC. I'm going to talk about different models for professional practice. And then I'm going to talk about a specific model called conjoint behavioral consultation. And I'm going to apply that model to a hypothetical AAC case study. And then you'll also get to practice some components of the model with another case study. And then I'm going to talk about some inevitable challenges and considerations when working on a team. Now, throughout this presentation, I'll give you opportunities to respond to some questions and other types of things to the things that I talk about. So if you're following along on the handout, try not to peek at the answer on the next slide when I ask questions. I wanted you to have slides available that have the answers on them or the correct answers on them, but this also means you can't cheat. You also might need a pen and paper to respond to some of the questions that I ask, so I'll give you a moment to get them now. Okay, hopefully that was enough time. First, we're going to talk, or I'm going to talk some about autism and AAC. So most of us, I'm assuming if you're watching this presentation, work with children with autism, and also we are at the National Autism Conference. But we all know that children with autism have a diverse spectrum of needs. And like I said, I'm not going to review all of them, but I think it's important to understand how wide that spectrum can be. So usually one of the earliest signs of autism is trouble developing relationships and responding to social cues. So how might this look? Well, this is a short clip of a 20-month-old, and you'll see that his mom is engaging with him, but he's not engaging in the typical social type of reciprocity that we might see in a typically developing 20-month-old. This little boy has autism.
Look at Logan. Hi, Petey. Logan.
Okay, so any SLPs who are watching this presentation might have noticed something else in this video clip. And that's that this little boy did not utter a single speech sound throughout this entire video. And this is a fairly common profile that we see in toddlers with autism. So what else might we see in autism? Well, there's a tendency to engage in repetitive and ritualized behavior, things like flapping, lining up toys, and spinning. Children with autism might have some restricted interests, and it's not simply that they're interested in particular a toy or an item or a character, because most kids have interests in these kinds of things. Children with autism also show an intense focus on these things to the point where it can be difficult to disrupt them or interest them in anything else. So here's a little boy who has a very intense interest in his numbers. I want you to take some note of the things that he does when his mom tries to engage with him and when she interrupts his game.
Sorry. You took the 1 and the 2. You're taking all your numbers, except for the 0. Put something water here. You make it What number is this, Timmy? What number is that? 1? 1, 2, 3. Look, count. 1, 2, 3, 4. What number is that? 5, 6. You know them. 6, right. 6. What's next?
Cute. So you can see the first thing he did when she interrupted his game was move away from her. He took all of his toys away. He whined a little, and he was overall very intent on lining up those numbers. He basically did whatever he could to communicate to his mom to stop interrupting him. What is going on here? There we go. Oops. All right, sorry about that. Children with autism might have unusual response. Oh, wrong one. Children with autism might be resistant to change and transitions. And this can result in some problem behavior when they don't like what's going on. And then they also can have unusual responses to sensory stimulation. And this sometimes includes the things they will and will not eat. And here are conditions that can occur alongside of autism. Common ones include intellectual disability and sleep disorders. And all children with autism have communication needs. And we often see extreme variation in their communication methods. And this is what our current discussion will focus on today. Usually when we say children with autism aren't verbal, what we really mean is that they don't use a formal method of communication. Children with autism often develop methods of communicating like this, but those methods aren't always very effective and they're not always very safe for the child or for the people around them. And in fact, an estimated 25 to 30% of children with autism will need to learn communication methods other than speech. So this leads us to AAC. AAC stands for Augmentative and Alternative Communication. And this means any formal method of supplementing or replacing speech for individuals with spoken communication impairments. So what do I mean by a formal method of replacing or substituting speech? Well, we need to distinguish between a response form and a response function. So a response form is the general shape and physical characteristics of a behavior, whereas the function is the reason for the behavior. And I'll give you some examples. So I may walk out the door or I may jump out the window. And both of these things might be to get outside. So these are two different forms, walking out the door, jumping out the window, that serve the same function of getting outside. Or I could be running to exercise, or I could be running to escape danger. This is one form, running, that serves two different functions, exercising and escaping danger. So we also have form and function when it comes to communication. When we talk about function, we usually talk about verbal and nonverbal responses, where verbal means the purpose of the response is to communicate, and then nonverbal means not communication. So things like coughing or crossing your legs. And when it comes to form, we can talk about vocal or non-vocal. So we can have vocal verbal behavior, and that usually means speech. But we can also have non-vocal verbal behavior, and that's often AAC, but not always. But recognize that when we talk about an AAC system itself, um, we are usually referring to response form. Okay, so this is what most teachers and service providers probably think about today when they think about an AAC form, and that is a tablet with some sort of AAC app on it. But this is just one kind of AAC system, and it's called a speech generating device, or SGD. But there are many, many more. There's simple gestures like pointing, formal sign languages and finger spelling, communication books, communication boards, single message switches. It's hard to see up there. There we go. Eye gaze technology, talking, dedicated AAC devices. Here's a talking keyboard. And then don't forget your standard paper and pencil. And like I said, there are many more options. As you can tell, I just ran out of space on the slide. So now it's time for you to think and respond at home. So you decide if this statement uses the term AAC correctly. Emma uses sign to communicate, and Adam uses an AAC. So this statement uses the term AAC incorrectly, but it's very common for professionals to mistakenly use AAC and speech generating device interchangeably. But remember that AAC means augmentative and alternative communication. It includes any formal method of communicating other than speech. So it's not accurate to say a student uses an AAC, because it's not, you wouldn't say they would use an alternative, augmentative and alternative communication. A better statement would be Emma uses sign to communicate and Adam uses a speech generating device. So what's the problem? Why am I even presenting on this? Well, the problem is that there's generally poor school outcomes for students who use AAC. And so the primary challenge for school staff is to overcome poor progress and what's known as AAC abandonment. Now, I've seen countless times when AAC systems or forms are left in a student's backpack or on top of a shelf in school. And they might come out when the student goes to speech, they may come out at snack time, but usually they're sort of left in places for most of the day. And when this happens, students don't gain the skills they need to make AAC effective and useful for them. So they stop using it, they abandon it. So Fallon described two primary reasons for poor progress in AAC in schools, and that's lack of collaboration and insufficient high quality instruction and practice. But these two factors are probably related. Lack of collaboration is likely one cause for insufficient, high quality instruction and practice. When there's only one person on the team who is teaching and practicing AAC with the student, students don't get enough practice. And in fact, collaboration has been consistently emphasized in the literature as important to the success of AAC instruction. So the takeaway is children with autism need a spectrum of supports to meet their needs. AAC intervention cannot be a one-person job. It takes a village, but how do we collaborate effectively and especially in a way that ensures good outcomes for these students? Well, there are different models for professional practice, and these models can actually impact the ways that we can and do collaborate as a team. The three models we're going to discuss today are multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary models. So first, let's talk about multidisciplinary models. Schools don't typically look like this, but you might find clinical environments that look like this. So maybe a pediatrician recommends to a parent that they contact different professionals. And then the professionals are contacted separately, and they all do different evaluations, and they generate different reports and recommendations, and they each have different goals and teaching methods and do different data collection. So basically, in a multidisciplinary model, every professional works on their own and stays in their own silos. They just happen to be working with the same child. Here is the interdisciplinary model. And this is a little bit better. The professionals complete different assessments, but then they coordinate enough to integrate the reports and recommendations. Families might be involved, but they usually don't have a lot of input in this model. But then each professional goes on their separate ways. So they have different goals, different data systems. You can sometimes have communication between professionals to give suggestions to one another or to discuss the student's progress, but they're still mostly all working within their own domains. And an interdisciplinary model is usually what we see in schools. So we have team members in the schools completing separate assessments. They get together and generate a single report, which is an IEP. But then you have different professionals who are primarily responsible for addressing different IEP goals. So you might have the occupational therapist goals, the SLP's goals, the teacher's goals. And it might not be explicitly written this way in an IEP, but it's generally how things are carried out in the schools. And then we have the transdisciplinary model for collaboration. And this is a truly integrated program. Professionals and parents coordinate and they discuss things they are assessing and why. They generate an integrated report and recommendations. And I think what's most important about this is that they all work on the same goals. They use the same teaching methods and they coordinate or use the same data systems. So how might we spot a transdisciplinary model in the schools? Well, with this model, we only have one set of goals, and that's the student's goals. And then all professionals work on these goals together. Now, the law doesn't specify that different professionals must work on different goals, and outcomes are likely better when the services are more cohesive. This model is less common in the schools, and it usually involves a big change for most IEP teams. Here's another opportunity to practice. Which model of professional practice best fits this scenario? Christopher is a student with an IEP. His teacher works on goals related to identifying colors, shapes, and numbers. His SLP works on goals related to requesting and labeling items using his speech generating device. His OT works on goals related to cutting and handwriting. The professionals try to communicate with one another to offer tips and discuss progress. Would it be A, multidisciplinary, B, interdisciplinary, or C, transdisciplinary? And the answer is B. This is an interdisciplinary model. An IEP includes a single report and recommendations from all professionals. But beyond the IEP, these professionals are working separately and within their own domains. Here's another example. Which model of professional practice best fits this scenario? Amaya is a student with an IEP. Her parents expressed concerns about communication and toileting. School staff are additionally concerned about challenging behaviors. Amaya's teacher, SLP, OT, and parents all contributed to her IEP addressing AAC, toilet training, and replacement behaviors for challenging behaviors. All team members work on these goals. So is it A, multidisciplinary, B, interdisciplinary, or C, transdisciplinary? And of course, the answer is C. This is a transdisciplinary model. All team members had input about what to assess and address. All team members contributed to the IEP based on their expertise. And then all team members worked on the same things. Now, the benefit of a transdisciplinary model like the one described is that the student is treated like a whole individual rather than a collection of separate and independent skills. So again, it makes a cohesive program that addresses the student as a whole. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about a type of transdisciplinary model, and this is called conjoint behavioral consultation, or CBC. And we'll apply it to AAC interventions and then also to a hypothetical case study, little Avery here. And then you'll get the opportunity to apply some components of the model to another case study. So what is CBC? CBC is a collaborative problem-solving model that focuses on promoting positive and consistent outcomes. And this is from the authors. Um, so this sounds like something that would be useful, right? We're aiming for positive and consistent AAC outcomes. Also, CBC stands out among a variety of collaboration models for its measured success. So it's actually research-based. So let's delve a little bit further into CBC. CBC is a four-step process that involves needs identification, needs analysis, plan implementation, and plan evaluation. Now, these steps might not be surprising to professionals who already work in schools because they kind of look like the IEP process, where we have an evaluation, IEP development, service delivery, and progress monitoring. But it's in the details that makes the difference. And the first difference between CBC and a typical IEP process is that the steps are more like an ongoing cycle rather than linear. So they're not one and done during the school year. So let's talk a little bit more about each step as it applies to AAC. All right, so first we're going to talk about needs identification. And the key question here is, what does the student need to work on? Needs identification involves a comprehensive assessment by the team to determine present levels, and it involves prioritization of student needs. And this is an important component of this step. So let's first talk about assessment, and let's talk about AAC assessment in particular. So remember how we talked about there being a variety of AAC systems or forms available? Each of these AAC systems requires different component skills to be able to be operated independently. So you have to be able to do different things to work these systems without any help from somebody else. And we also talked about how different students can present with different needs. So the lesson to be learned about selecting AAC form is one AAC system does not best fit all students. I'll repeat, one AAC system is not the best fit for all students. So for example, we should not have a school or district-wide AAC system recommendation. I have seen this in schools before. So that begs the question, how do we determine what AAC system to pick? Well, we need to do what's called feature matching. We need to assess the students' present levels, which what we do in this stage. And then we also assess other environmental and social conditions that they live in. And then we match these features to various AAC systems. So these are just some examples of skills that are important to assess for feature matching. And I'm not going to read all of them to you, but I want you to notice how many skills there are. There are a lot of different skills that are relevant to AAC system selection. Also, certain skills seem to match with certain professional expertise. But I think it's important for you to understand that it doesn't have to be this way. The point of CBC is that professionals contribute where they have the relevant knowledge and skills, and it doesn't matter what their titles are. Now, along with assessing those general areas, there are some formal AAC assessment tools, AAC form assessment tools. Now, formal tools offer some advantages to more informal methods. First, they make the process more systematic, so teams are consistent in how they assess AAC systems. They can also make the process more objective. It's difficult to argue that a team member is biased towards or against an AAC system when the team has agreed to follow what the tool recommends. But it's also important to recognize that formal tools have disadvantages. Mainly, anything that's more standardized has limitations when applying it to individual situations. And that's basically what these cons show. So, for example, an assessment tool might determine that a single message switch would be easy for a particular student to learn and to operate. But a student can't learn more advanced language by using a switch. And this is because the messages are pre recorded and there really are no other options to say anything different than what's on the switch. So here is one formal AAC assessment tool that I often recommend because it does consider a lot of important features of individual situations. It's the alternative method of speaking comparison tool from the Essential for Living curriculum. The AMS comparison tool doesn't just look at student skills. It also looks at factors of the listeners or audience, so the people the students will be talking to or communicating with. And it looks at things like portability of the system, complexity, effort, and advanced language capabilities, which is what I was just talking about previously. I promise I am not an essential for living salesperson. I get no financial kickbacks for this recommendation. I've just found this tool to be very useful to IEP teams in making AAC system decisions. Great. Here's another opportunity for you to respond. True or false? Most individuals with autism are visual learners. Therefore, picture based AAC systems are usually the best fit for this population. And the answer is false. In general, research has demonstrated that the idea of learning styles is a myth. So there's no such thing as a visual learner or a tactile learner. And then also, research is beginning to show that people with autism may actually respond worse to pictures than both other students with disabilities and compared to typically developing peers. But there are other myths that are common in this area and are important to address. So, after assessing a student's needs as a team, we need to prioritize needs. And as I said before, prioritization is a very important step. If the team doesn't prioritize skills to work on collectively, then collaboration doesn't work. We might get an interdisciplinary model at best. But when it comes to AAC and communication, there's a common myth that can inhibit prioritization of needs. And that myth is language and academic skills are separate skill areas to be addressed primarily by different professionals. But the fact is, most academic skills are language skills. They're just more complex language skills. So a child can't effectively read without a foundation in simpler language skills. And a child can't add or subtract effectively without a foundation in simpler language skills. Now, they might be able to do it rotely, but they're not going to be able to use that information to do anything functional in their lives. So we have to stop pigeonholing ourselves as professionals and recognize that AAC should probably be a primary focus for all team members. Now, it might not be always be the priority, But it often is because language is the foundation for so many other skills. And remember, you're not ignoring needs. You're not saying other needs aren't important or will never be addressed. But these students have a lot of things to work on, and the team has to do some triage to figure out what to work on first. And often, communication is the biggest priority. So let's see what the needs identification stage revealed about our case study, Avery. What did we learn from assessment? Well, Avery is 3 years old, so she's a preschooler. She shows no spontaneous speech and also doesn't easily imitate speech. And these are key findings that let us know that she needs to be taught AAC. She responds to her name when called, but she does not follow other simple directions without prompting. Avery has some fine motor impairments, and she also shows moderate challenging behaviors like screaming, kicking, crying, and throwing items. Avery loves being active. She likes to be on the playground, swimming, jumping, running, similar activities. Also, her family is active. So they frequently are out running errands. They're frequently taking siblings to sports practices and other activities. So based on assessment, the team did some feature matching. They recognized that Avery needs an AAC system that's easily used and transported because she and her family like to move around a lot. They also need a system that's not easily broken or ruined because, again, Avery is active. And also, part of her challenging behaviors involve throwing items, at least for now. And they need a system that can accommodate fine motor adaptations. And that's because she does show some fine motor impairments. Now, after using the AMS comparison tool, the team decided on a sequence of AAC forms. And this is, I think, a really important message for you to understand. Students can learn multiple ways of communicating, just like we learn multiple ways of communicating. It doesn't always have to be one and done. So the team decided that they would start teaching Avery a mixture of standard signs and adapted signs. And this follows the previous discussion that we had about what they recognized she needed in her AAC system as well. And they decided on adapted signs because of Avery's fine motor difficulties. But they will shape those signs to standard signs with help from the OT. And then as Avery's communication skills grow and her community grows, so as she begins to want to communicate with a larger population of people, and potentially even people she's only met for the first time, the team will teach her to type and to select text to communicate with the people who might not understand her signs. But of course, this is if she doesn't learn to talk first. She's only 3 years old. And speaking of learning to talk, this presentation is about AAC, and I recognize it's not about vocal training. But I think I would be remiss as an SLP if I didn't remind you to not give up on speech. Just because we teach a student AAC doesn't mean the goal for speech flies out the window. You can work on both. And in fact, you should work on both a vast majority of the time. And a child as young as Avery should have some vocal training to help her learn how to talk. So Dr. Barbara Esch, there's a couple resources here. So Dr. Barbara Esch has presentations in the National Autism Conference archives focusing on vocal training. And I also included a link on this slide to a presentation on vocal training that I did with my colleague Amy Four. And then finally, there are two presentations this year at NAC on Thursday morning and afternoon, and they're both about vocal training, and I also included them on this slide. So you have several ways of gaining information about how to teach speech along with AAC. Don't give up on speech. Okay, so now that you've identified and prioritized the student's needs, the team has to identify how to address those needs. What should they teach and how? And this happens in the needs analysis stage. And it's in this stage when the team develops mutual IEP goals and mutual teaching procedures. And I'll go into these in a little more detail as they relate to AAC. All right, so first we'll talk about goals. Many professionals had some training in goal writing, and they recognize it's important to be clear and specific when writing goals. But this is especially true with shared AAC goals, where multiple people will be implementing them. So we know that every goal should describe exactly when we expect the skill to occur. They also need to describe what the skill looks like. And then finally, the goal needs to talk about how often the skill should occur, and then the team's consensus for when the skill is mastered. And I'll go into these pieces a little bit more, and especially as they relate to AAC. All right, so we'll start with the targeted behavior itself, the what. We have to be sure that we're being precise enough when describing the skill that it requires no interpretation by anyone else, because again, a lot of people are working on this skill. So let's look at this example and determine, is this clear enough and why? Sam will use picture exchange to request preferred items. Is it clear enough? Why or why not? Even something that seems clear, like Sam will use picture exchange, is too ambiguous. So first, we don't know the visual field. So is Sam going to pick up an isolated picture from the table? Will there be 5 other pictures? Will there be 10 other pictures? Second, we haven't specified that Sam will be exchanging the correct picture. We need to specify the picture actually corresponds to the item that he wants. So we need to describe exactly what Sam is expected to do. So for example, Sam will pick up and exchange the picture that corresponds to a preferred item from a minimum array of 5 pictures. But knowing what the student will do isn't sufficient. You must also define when the response should occur. And this should involve identifying observable natural cues in the environment. What do I mean by this? Well, let's start with some common mistakes. And I actually found some of the examples on a very popular AAC website. So what could be wrong with this when statement or these observable natural cues? Or they're not, what's wrong with it? When Tommy wants to direct the actions of a teacher or peer, I was a little confusing with that question, so I'll go a little faster here. The problem with that condition is that it's not observable. I don't know what Tommy or his environment look like that would tell me that he wants to direct the action of a teacher or peer. Let's try this again. How about this other commonly written condition? What's wrong with this statement? Given gestural and verbal prompts, and the problem is that prompts are not natural cues for a behavior to occur. Prompts are how we teach skills. Remember, an IEP goal tells us what the student should do and when, right? It's not meant to tell us how we teach. So prompts or prompt levels generally don't belong in IEP goals. So here are some examples of condition statements that include observable natural cues. When a preferred activity is paused, when shown a picture of a common item and asked, "What is this?" When a preferred item is out of reach, or when asked a specific question about personal information, such as, "What's your last name?" or "Who is your mom?" Now, these statements might not be perfect, but each of these contexts is relatively clear and unambiguous. So we know what they look like, and they're natural cues rather than prompts or teaching procedures. And finally, we need to talk about mastery criterion. One tip the CBC model emphasizes is to decide on your data system before you write the goal and the mastery criterion. And this is because your mastery criterion should match your data collection methods. Now, I know, at least for me, data collection is effortful. So the last thing we want to do is write a goal that would make the data we collect useless. Now, these are common ways to collect data in schools. And I also have example mastery criteria that match those methods. So we have count, rate, duration, and percentage data here. And the team should decide what kind of data make the most sense for the given skill and then write the mastery criterion accordingly. So here's an example goal. Sam will ask a peer to play with 80% accuracy in 4 out of 5 trials. Now, this goal is confusing to me, but I've encountered goals like this in schools. Something like this usually happens because there's a standard or form mastery criterion that is sort of tagged on to every goal without much thought. But here's the problem. How should I collect data on this? What's 80% accuracy of asking a peer to play? And how will I know there will be 5 trials? So in the end, this goal and the mastery criterion don't correspond to a feasible data system. Then we have this other goal. Sam will ask a peer to play 3 times in a 30-minute recess period. Ah, now this does correspond to a feasible data system, counting. I know I need to count. I can clearly understand how to collect data on this goal. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how you can write your mastery criterion to help you with your data collection, and how devising your data system first will help you write your mastery criterion. So what about teaching procedures? Well, the CBC model emphasizes that everyone on the team should be using the same procedures when working on the same goal with the same student. So when everyone is supposed to do the same thing, they benefit from what's known as a procedural manual or a treatment manual. And a manual should include at least 3 components: how to teach the skill, so the instructor behaviors, what the student is expected to do, so the student behaviors, and then what to do when the student doesn't respond as expected. And these are known as error correction procedures. Treatment manuals come in many forms, and it's important for you and your team to recognize the many options you have available. Treatment manuals can be large, formal manuals like this one, but they can also be developed by members on the team who are knowledgeable about the skill being taught and who are knowledgeable about how to teach the skill. So something like this short checklist could also work as a manual. And a checklist will be handy for something I'll talk about later too. And you can also make a video manual as long as it contains the 3 necessary components, and that is instructor behaviors, student behaviors, and error correction procedures. So let's see if this one does.
Hi. Mira. That's right. Mira. That's right. Mira. Oh, did I distract you then? Sock. Right. That's the mirror. That's right. Charlotte, where's your nose? Where's your nose? Show me your nose, Charlotte. Charlotte, show me your nose. It's falling out. That's right. Mirror.
So things don't always happen exactly as planned, but I did see the 3 necessary components. I saw how the instructor is expected to teach the skill. I saw what the student is expected to do, and I saw what the instructor should do when the student makes a mistake. So let's look at how this applies to Avery. Her team decided that counting data using first trial probes would show them whether she's learning new signs. First trial probes involve seeing what the student does independently the first time the task is presented to the student during the day. So Avery's team decided on this requesting goal. When a preferred item is out of Avery's reach during a play session, and she reaches for or smiles at the item, Avery will use the corresponding manual sign for the preferred item for 3 consecutive first trial probes. And she'll learn to sign for 25 different preferred items during the IEP timeline. So again, we're counting here. And I know this checklist is small, but you don't need to actually be able to read these steps. The important piece to recognize is that Avery's teacher and her SLP work together to develop a checklist manual that describes sign teaching procedures. Okay, so now it's time to put the AAC plan into action, plan implementation. This part is actually one of the easier pieces to the puzzle since you put so much detail into the preparation, but there are some key pieces to discuss relevant to the CBC model. So this stage involves team training, ensuring instruction is delivered as planned, and then ensuring data collection is consistent across team members. So let's first talk about team training. Team training is an important part of collaborative AAC intervention, but it's also important to recognize that there's flexible trainer-trainee roles depending on who has the best knowledge of skills of the treatment at the time of training. So again, we need role release. Just as professionals don't own IEP goals, they also don't own the position as a trainer. So we have to be open to getting feedback from various members of the team. And just like everything else, there are various options for training. So you can train in person, and this is usually ideal, but you can also use pre-recorded video modeling, like the video I showed you, the picture exchange video. And you can even do video conferencing like Skype and Zoom, and we should all be familiar with video conferencing at this point. But the most important piece about training is giving the trainee feedback on their performance. And this is true even if you use a video. So you have to find a method of observing the trainee and giving feedback. And the kind of feedback the trainee needs is, what did they do that was right? What should they change? And then how should they change it? But training isn't the only important piece of effective AAC instruction. We also have to make sure procedures are implemented as described. And so we do that by objectively measuring what's called treatment fidelity. And instead of me telling you about treatment fidelity, I thought this video would be helpful.
Hi there. I'm Dr. Mel, your coach on this journey about implementing research evidence in real-world practice settings. Together with my coaching team, Raluca, Sabine, and Melissa, we're going to identify some of the key things we've learned from studying implementation in children's mental health organizations and schools. So follow me in this bird's eye view of some of the top lessons we've learned that can help you stay on track to successfully implementing evidence-based care in your organization. This clip is about fidelity. Practicing in an evidence-based manner requires fidelity. Fidelity simply means delivering an evidence-based treatment in the way intended by the treatment developers. It's a bit like following a recipe. There are ingredients that are essential and others that can be left to the cook's discretion. If there are 4 key elements to the intervention, then you must address all 4. Clinicians often practice with flexibility depending on client needs, their training, or their philosophy. But getting too creative can mean you're no longer delivering the treatment as intended with fidelity. Asking, how well did I do in sticking to the key elements, can go a long way to improving fidelity and consequently your client's outcomes. And there are tools that can help. For example, we've used the Becky, the Behavior Change Counseling Index, to help clinicians monitor their fidelity with motivational interviewing. Rated by themselves or by a coach, the Becky identifies how well clinicians deliver the key elements of motivational interviewing in practice and where they can improve. It's a more objective way of asking, how am I doing with key elements? Successful implementation means making fidelity monitoring a routine part of your practice. It's the challenge you must meet in order to realize good implementation and good client outcomes.
So fidelity is always important. But it's especially important when you're working on collaborative teams to not get too creative about how you're implementing procedures. And this is because it makes it difficult to figure out what actually contributed to the student's performance when we're not sticking to the key components like they described in the video.
Hi there.
So remember this checklist. It can also be used to objectively assess treatment fidelity. Now, direct observation by a trained person is considered the gold standard for measuring treatment fidelity. But again, direct observation doesn't only have to happen in person. It can be done using video conferencing or video recording, where the person records themselves in a session and then sends the video to someone else, or a person can watch themselves. Remember, you're a trained team member, so it's possible to evaluate yourself as long as you're honest. I've done all of these things in practice. I've been observed in person, I've been observed through video conferencing, and have also recorded videos. Now, self-report checklists can also supplement direct observation. For example, you might have a team member check off whether they completed the steps immediately after an AAC session. But self-report checklists filled out in that way aren't ideal. And it's not because professionals want to lie or deceive people. I mean, this may sometimes be the case, but I think most professionals are honest and want to actually help students. It's mainly because we're bad multitaskers, and this is especially true when we're learning to do something new. We have to manage what we're doing, we have to manage the student, and then also somehow take note of how well we're doing it. And it's just very, very difficult to multitask in this way. And then in addition to making sure the procedures are solid, the teaching procedures, we also want to make sure that everyone is collecting data in the same way, or we can't depend on the data to inform us about the student. And remember, collaboration means several members of the team are probably going to be involved in collecting data on the same skill. So teams should occasionally measure what's known as inter-observer agreement, or IOA, and they do this to be sure data collection is consistent between team members. IOA involves usually two people, observing and collecting data on the same instructional session, and then it's usually represented as a percentage of agreement between the observers. Okay, so here's an example of two hypothetical team members, the SLP and the teacher, collecting data on the picture exchange session from the previous video. Let's see how they do.
Thanks. Mira.
Oh, let's try this again.
Thanks. Mira.
Here.
That's right. Mira. That's right. Mira. Oh, do I distract you then? Sock. Right. That's the mirror. That's right. Charlotte, where's your nose? Where's your nose? Show me your nose, Charlotte. Charlotte. Show me your nose. It's falling out. That's right. Mirror.
Okay, so recognize that whole last sequence was a single trial, a single error correction, or a single error that resulted in an error correction procedure. And both data collectors recognize this because they didn't make a mistake there. So we see that we have these two data sets, and there were 4 trials total. And the SLP and the teacher agreed on 3 of them. So they had 1 disagreement. So this means that the SLP and teacher has 75% inter-observer agreement. Now, notice that calculating IOA doesn't tell us whose data were correct. It only tells us if the observers agree. It also doesn't tell us the reason for disagreement. So when IOA percentages are low, this should be a signal for the team to discuss and review their definitions of skills to figure out why they disagree. It could be something that's really simple, like one person wasn't paying as close attention as another person. Okay, now it's your turn to calculate IOA. You might need a calculator for this, but I tried to make it really easy by including 10 total trials. So here are 2 data sets. Determine the SLP's and OT's percentage of agreement. Okay, so remember there were 10 total trials and there were 2 disagreements here, and so 8 agreements. So this means you should have calculated an IOA of 80%. So let's look at what Avery's team did in this stage. They decided to use a video to assist with training, and this slide has a link to a patent video on teaching signs. Patent Autism Initiative in general has a lot of handy videos on teaching procedures on the website, and it's a little plug there. Avery's team also decided that they needed the OT's help in training and providing feedback on teaching the appropriate adapted signs. And the team also decided they would collect treatment fidelity and IOA data at least twice per month, and they would rotate who the observers would be. Right, we're almost there. Really strong goals, procedures, and data systems still aren't enough. The end goal is an effective AAC intervention and one with good outcomes. So we have to evaluate our intervention frequently to determine if it's working. And this happens in the plan evaluation stage of CBC. The plan evaluation stage involves graphing data, making a decision about progress, and then making a change in the plan if necessary. So why graph all data? Let's talk about graphing. Throughout my consulting, I noticed most professionals didn't really have a problem using graphs that were automatically graphed for them. So this might happen in some computerized curriculum-based measures or curriculum-based progress monitoring assessments. So essentially what happens with these is that the student sits down at the computer, they take whatever assessment is necessary, and then the assessment generates a graph automatically. But the problem was that professionals I encountered really didn't tend to graph outside of when the data were graphed automatically. So why is it important to graph all data? Well, graphs are the best and most effective way to see change over time. And that's the goal of teaching. That's the purpose of an IEP. So if we take a look at these two graphs, for example, we can very quickly and easily see which student here is progressing and which student is not. And this is just 1 month's worth of data. Think of the difference we could make for Timmy with this information. But even graphing isn't enough. We have to actually use the graphs to make decisions. Now, the CBC model recommends data decision rules, and these are prescribed formulas for determining program changes. So essentially, they're rules that are preset by the team that tell them what graphs should look like if the team's going to continue instruction, and then what graphs should look like if they need to make a change. And research has shown that data decision rules are more effective than other methods of judgment when guiding instructional decisions. So here's one example of a data decision rule, and this one was discussed by Greer and Ross. For this set of rules, the team only needs between 4 and 6 data points to determine whether or not they're going to make an instructional change. So let's practice. Oops. What should this team do? According to these data decision rules. So according to these rules, what should the team do? And recognize that this is a skill that needs to increase. So even though these data are variable, the trend is going up. It's an ascending trend. And so the team should probably continue their intervention. Here's another example of a data decision rule, and this one is known as the points below rule. This one uses a goal line. And so the goal line shows the expected rate of progress on a goal based on the annual IEP timeline. The points below rule says that the team should make a change if 3 consecutive data points are below the goal line for a skill that needs to increase. And this is because if they don't make a change, the student might not meet the IEP goal on time. Okay, so time to practice again. This graph includes a goal line, and according to the points below rule, what should this team do? So for now, the team should continue instruction. The last 3 data points still are hovering around the goal line. And this is actually fortunate because I used the same example graph to apply both data decision rules. So it shows that they can correspond with one another. Now, AAC teams don't have to use these data decision rules. They can make up their own, but it's important to use a data decision rule. For one thing, they keep decisions about data objective and uniform across team members, so we're not disagreeing about whether a student is making progress. But probably more important or most important is that they prevent needless delay in changing instruction when progress is not apparent. Sometimes qualitatively, we can think that a student is making progress, but the data actually show that they're not. So something like a data decision rule helps prevent us from delaying change when it's necessary. So what should the team do if a change is necessary? Well, they need to revisit earlier CBC stages. So remember how I discussed the steps are a cycle rather than linear. So when the data tell us we need a change, the team revisits the needs identification stage to assess the problem and potentially hypothesize a cause. And then they modify the plan in the needs analysis stage. And then finally, they rinse and repeat. They continue in the cycle. Now, I want to emphasize that modifying the plan doesn't necessarily mean a change to the formal IEP that requires a meeting. And I know this can be stressful and sometimes frustrating to people to continuously have to have an IEP meeting every time there's a change. The change might just mean tweaking teaching procedures. And remember, teaching procedures aren't included in IEP goals. So here's a list of possible instructional changes based on how the team analyzes the problem. And I want to direct your attention to a simple change that I often first recommend to AAC teams. And that change is to increase the number of teaching trials. Now, students who use AAC typically need hundreds of trials. We can't skimp on the teaching opportunities. But also, this is a big benefit of the CBC model because everyone on the team is working on the same skill. So students actually get way more instruction on that skill than they would typically get if there was only one person teaching it. So how does the plan evaluation stage look for Avery? Well, the team decided to use the points below rule with Avery's graphs, and you can see her goal line there. And Avery's graph shows that early on, she started learning signs very quickly, but then she began to plateau to a level that risked not meeting her IEP goal in time. So the team discussed and assessed the problem. They hypothesized that Avery didn't consistently want the items that they were presenting to her, which means she wasn't motivated to sign for them. The items weren't really preferred items for her. And in general, this is a common problem you might encounter in early AAC instruction. So the team modified the plan. They decided that they would conduct an assessment to see if there are any new preferred items that might interest Avery that they didn't previously um, find. And then they would change Avery's instructional targets to match the items she most preferred after that assessment. So again, nothing needed to be change that required a formal IEP meeting. And it looks like the intervention worked. So changing to different targets put Avery right back on track to being on target for meeting her IEP goal. All right, so now it's time for you to practice some of these steps at home. So we're going to do another case study, and this is Alex. And I recognize that most of you aren't watching this presentation with your school teams, so I'll emphasize in different areas and in different places in the presentation. I'll emphasize the advantages of making some of these decisions as a team. So let's start with the needs identification stage. All right, so here we go. Alex is 16 years old. He can talk, but his speech is highly unintelligible. And this means that the people around him often can't understand what he says. It's another reason why we might teach AAC to a student. But unfortunately, Alex never used an AAC system, and this situation is more common than we would like. He'll usually guide people to the things that he wants and needs, or like any other 16-year-old, he'd just go around and get them himself. Alex can read between a third and fourth grade level. And remember, he does have the language skills because he does have some speech to be able to read at that level. And he's able to answer some written multiple choice questions using reading. He has some fine motor impairments. He can write, but he dislikes writing and he often protests writing tasks. But his handwriting is sloppy but legible. People can understand it. Alex loves to play video games and watch his favorite movies and television shows. He also has been performing basic jobs around his high school. So for example, the school has a staff coffee service that's run by students, and Alex helps with that. And Alex will soon begin an off-site job at a fast food restaurant based on a collaboration the school has with the restaurant itself. And he's very excited about this job because he loves this particular restaurant. All right, so based on those needs that we assessed, it's time for you to make some decisions. So which AAC system seems most appropriate in this case? A picture-based speech generating device, because Alex dislikes writing and he can easily scan pictures in video games. A speech generating device with typing and word prediction, because Alex can read and write, and typing is generally quicker than scrolling through multiple pages of pictures. Or manual sign language, because sign language is the most portable AAC system, and Alex will be traveling frequently to a job site. Now, before you make your decision, I want you to notice that arguments can be made for all of these options, and there are probably arguments for other options as well. And this is precisely why we work on teams and make decisions collaboratively. Everybody on the team might not recognize that all of these things I discussed here are important for the AAC decision. And so working as a team helps to draw everybody's attention to different people's perspectives. So your decision might not match mine, but I think one of these options stands out among others. Which one would you choose? All right. So I would say a speech generating device with typing and word prediction makes the most sense here for several reasons. First, we know that Alex dislikes writing, but typing doesn't usually involve the same precise motor control of writing. So it might be less difficult for Alex, and especially with word prediction options. Also, Alex can say or type infinite things by typing, and some words might not be available in pictures. And then, just like this explanation says, typing can be quicker than scrolling through pages and pages of pictures. And sign language probably wouldn't be the best choice in this case because Alex will likely be interacting with strangers who don't understand signs at his job site. So hopefully you can see just how systematic and individualized AAC form decisions should be. Alex's form does not match what we thought should be Avery's AAC form. And so also I hope you see how it's generally best done on a team. So let's move on to the needs analysis stage. One AAC goal the team prioritized was related to asking questions. They thought Alex might need to ask his boss and coworkers where things are at the job site. Now recognize there are many prerequisite skills Alex needed to make this goal appropriate for him, and I'm not going to go into them all now. We're just going to assume that Alex demonstrates these skills. Alex also had other IEP goals. This probably wouldn't be the only one, but we're going to focus on this one for now. Okay, so the team wrote the following IEP goal. When Alex wants to know where a specific item or person is located, he will type where, object or person, at a maximum rate of 7 seconds per word, at least 5 times per day over 3 consecutive days. And at least one of those correct where questions must be previously untaught, meaning he's going to ask where something is that he never asked before. Okay, and so you determine whether the team's condition or context statement is clear enough. When Alex wants to know where a specific item or person is located, is this clear enough? Why or why not? Okay, so this condition statement is not clear enough because it's not an observable cue. What's going on in the environment that tells us Alex wants to know where a specific item or person is located? So the team revised the condition statement to include observable cues. When given a direction to retrieve a familiar item or bring something to a familiar person, and Alex does not find the item or person after searching relevant locations. Now, these are natural cues we often encounter right before asking where something is. Usually we go looking for something first in its usual location, and then we might ask for it after we can't find it. All right, so let's move on to the plan implementation stage for Alex. You might need a paper and a pen handy for this one because it does ask you to write. All right, so the OT needs to train the SLP, teacher, and paraprofessionals on procedures to teach Alex how to efficiently type. However, The OT will not be in the school building to train the staff in person. Write down 2 alternative training methods the OT might use. And remember, training needs to involve feedback for the trainee. Okay, so there are many options for this, and the 2 I wrote here aren't the only ones, but they're just examples. You can do video conferencing like Skype or Zoom. I keep bringing this up, but the OT could both train and give feedback that way. Also, you could provide written instructions along with the training video, and then you can ask the staff to send a video of their implementation and then give feedback that way. So the important takeaway from this slide and from this piece is that we sometimes need to think outside of the box when we're working on teams. Most things are possible even if you're not always together in person. And finally, let's evaluate Alex's plan. Okay, so here is Alex's graph of his progress on this goal. According to these data decision rules, what should the team do? Okay, so the team needs to make a change. Again, the data are variable, but Alex appears to be plateauing on the skill. So when assessing the problem, members of the team noticed that Alex wasn't always carrying his device with him when he went to get the requested item. And then he would approach a teacher when he couldn't find the item, but he had no effective way to communicate with them. And in fact, this is also a common problem that AAC teams face. Students don't always independently carry their AAC systems with them. So, given that identified cause, which instructional change would be most appropriate? A, change the physical teaching environment. B, provide a more valuable reinforcer when Alex asks a where question. C, modify prompting procedures to include prompts to pick up and carry his device. Or D, change the instructional target to what questions? And I think the clear answer is C, modify prompting procedures to include prompts to pick up and carry the device. And then of course the team would need procedures to fade those prompts so Alex doesn't become dependent on them. The problem really wasn't the where target itself, so changing the target wasn't necessary. And then we also want Alex to be able to ask where questions in a variety of environments. So we don't need to or want to change the physical teaching environment. We just need to help him remember to carry his device with him wherever he goes. And now it looks like that changed work for Alex. And actually, it also looks like he met his IEP goal of 5 correct where questions per day. So hopefully you can see the CBC process helps collaborative AAC teams to succeed, and it also helps students to succeed. The team makes strong program decisions for their students that are directly guided by data. And this AAC system is very happy now. But of course, there are definitely challenges to collaboration. So I won't sugarcoat it. Collaboration in schools is not easy, and this is especially true for students with autism, because these students tend to be some of our most challenging students to work with. Collaboration requires an agreement between team members to commit to the time, to frequent communication and interaction, and to be open to graying those professional boundaries and learning from one another. It's often easiest to start with a team who is truly open to collaboration, but that's not always possible in the schools. So here are some basic suggestions for teams. First, prearrange and stick to team meetings. Now, team meetings do not always have to involve all members of the team, and sometimes it'll be a meeting between just 2 members. But not being able to accommodate everyone is not a reason to forego team meetings altogether. And this is especially true with our recent environment and our recent situation that reminds us that technology can go far in helping us meet at a distance. Second, collaborative AAC instruction can be more difficult if administration is not on board, like principals. And this doesn't mean it's impossible. Witnessed amazing teams in schools where principals have very little understanding of what's actually happening in their special education classrooms. So it's not impossible, it's just more difficult. So teams might want to educate their administrators about the benefits of collaboration. Third, add collaboration or consultation time to IEPs. Now, besides this just being a logical step, if you're collaborating or consulting more, then you might want to add that to the student's IEP. It also offers a legal push to collaborate, so it helps it to be more likely to happen, and this can be also convincing to administrators in the building. And finally, create an environment that's open to effective communication between team members. And this one is often the biggest barrier to collaboration, so I'm going to go into it in a little bit more detail. So how do we support effective communication? The first thing I'm going to talk about is to try to make instructional decisions with at least one other team member. Now, this might seem obvious, but it's often unintentionally neglected. And it's just because of the hectic school environment or the hectic work environment. But whether it's intentional or not, it can sometimes be perceived as disrespectful. For example, in my experience, not many professionals consult someone else to make decisions about new vocabulary targets for AAC instruction. So remember when Avery was struggling with her goal, the team got together and assessed the problem, they assessed new preferred items, and they all collaboratively decided what new items they were going to target. But this doesn't often happen. And it might just seem like a mundane thing or a mundane decision that doesn't need anyone else's input. But recognize that this is a big deal. You're deciding what a student is going to learn to communicate about. And so other people might have input on that decision. The second suggestion is to not assume bad intent from people on the team. And in fact, it's probably best to not assume anything at all, to make no assumptions. We have to put down our shackles when we work on a team. If someone's giving us feedback or questioning why we're doing something, don't assume it's because they're picking on us or questioning our expertise. Consider the feedback and the questions to be genuine and then respond appropriately. And speaking of questions, you should ask questions of other team members. I think questioning is very important. But more important, you should actually listen to the answers. And this is related to not making assumptions about people's intent. So as an example, one time I was told by an SLP when I was consulting that a teacher abruptly changed a student's AAC system, their AAC form. And the SLP was pretty upset by this, and I could understand why. We shouldn't switch AAC systems unless there's a strong reason to do so. But instead of making accusations and assumptions, I approached the teacher with the SLP and I asked questions. I asked essentially why she chose to make that decision. And it turned out the teacher actually had ample data supporting the need for a change. She had been collecting data for about a month, and she had data that she tried different changes before making the AAC system change. So she really had a lot of data supporting the fact that the student needed a change in the system. But we wouldn't have figured this out if we had made accusations or made assumptions, and we certainly wouldn't have figured this out if we didn't ask questions. So in the end, the problem wasn't that the teacher made any changes abruptly, but there still was a problem. And that problem was that the teacher made a pretty big decision, a pretty big instructional decision, without consulting other members of the team. And this is why I put this suggestion first, because again, it was completely unintentional. The teacher wasn't purposely leaving the therapist out. It was just the hectic life of the school prevented her or made her not recognize that she needed to talk to somebody else. So in this particular situation, we discussed having more regular team meetings between the teacher and the SLP to avoid similar mistakes. And so related, another way to support effective communication is to stay calm. Now, I am all about you being able to make your case, and you have a right to defend your recommendations, but it's also important to do so respectfully. Remember that old adage, to treat others as you would want yourself treated in a similar situation. And Dr. Joanne Garenser brought up a great point in her presentation at last year's American Speech Language Hearing Association convention. It's something that I never actually even thought about before, and that's to try to connect with one another outside of the workplace. It helps you to get to know your colleagues as, or your team members as a person rather than the professional you see at school or work. And it can go a long way in building trust between professionals. Now, this can be more difficult in the COVID world, but I have had Zoom breakfasts and Zoom happy hours with friends since the start of quarantine, so it's definitely possible. And finally, we need to rely on science and evidence whenever possible. Now, the CBC model itself is a very scientific model, And in general, we tend to rely on science because we haven't found a method that works better in achieving outcomes. But this also means we need to acknowledge when another team member brings something to the table that has more evidence or that overall seems more logical and reasonable given the circumstances. And then don't forget, you can also test things out scientifically. So the CBC model offers you a way to determine if something is really working. We need to be humble and be bold. And this is a phrase that I love that Dr. Francesca Daly Espinosa said. And she's a frequent presenter at the National Autism Conference, and she will be presenting this year too, I think a few presentations, and the closing speaker. But what she meant by this is that she meant we should be humble enough to recognize valuable things other professionals can bring to the table, other professionals on the team. And we also need to be bold enough to try things that we didn't consider or that we didn't come up with ourselves. And of course, it's always best to begin with the end in mind. We all have the same goal, and that's to improve outcomes for students with autism. So we have to remember that it's not about us, this is for the student. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation, and I wish you all luck on your collaborative AAC teams. Please feel free to contact me at the email I will flash in my screen if you have any questions. Okay. Thank you, everyone.